Starting with the file ecosystem Mayo4, continuing from before with the scene, I'm going to go ahead and add in procedural terrain, and we're going to move that to the side. I'm going to go ahead and scale that down a bit. Just kind of fit it in there next to the current one with a slight intersection towards the bottom. I'm also going to go ahead and scale this down on the up and down z-axis. It's a little too large at the moment. And now I'm going to go ahead and just load in a new material. We'll go ahead and use the grass variations from landscapes. In the landscape library. Next one we're going to do is create a spline. So we're going to go to the spline object. And I'm going to create my first point in the perspective view. And then create the additional points in the top view. And when you create a spline, what it does is it drops it onto the object that you're clicking on. So this will match up to the terrain. And I'm going to go ahead now and set it to a closed spline. And what we're going to do is have an ecosystem effect. Now we can choose to populate an ecosystem around the spline by using the stroke method, or we can fill it. So I'm going to fill the ecosystem, populate with an ecosystem. Go ahead and add plants. We're going to go into trees, and I'm going to add the alder, and we'll add the cherry tree, maple tree, and I'm also going to add the soneratia. So we can populate that. And we've got something that's probably a little too large, so I'm going to go ahead and decrease the overall scaling. Also go into the maple tree in the general tab and change that to 0.06 for the scale, bring it down a bit. We can increase the density. So now we can see that ecosystem showing up within the spline. Now if we were to also add an ecosystem to the terrain underneath it, we're going to cut out other ecosystems. So within the spline editor panel, under fill. So this way, when we have another ecosystem populated on the terrain, this ecosystem will override it and cut it out when we populate. It kind of works like a decay near foreign object command. Also, I do want to go back, change that to dynamic population. Now we could also do and use the spline and add plants around the edge. And what I'm going to do is select the populate with an ecosystem option within the spline. And now what I'm going to do is add another plant. We're going to go to bushes and use the bush one crawling. And the other bush crawling. It doesn't look like many instances are showing, so what I'm going to do is change the width. It's about 12 meters for the stroke. Change our density. It might be a scale issue. It does look like it is. So we'll go into scaling and just reduce that down. Say 0.3, maybe 0.2. Switch it over to dynamic population. We also want to make sure that this is cutting out other ecosystems. And we can determine the percentage that it will remove from the other ecosystem on the right here. If we want to select a specific ecosystem, you can go down here to only selected ecosystem, and then you can choose a ratio for every ecosystem in the scene. Or if you want to populate on other objects, or whichever one's going to end up with an ecosystem. So now we have something on the spline going around it with the forest inside. I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor, go to sky, fog, and haze, and I do need to change my aerial perspective up a little higher. It was down to 0.1, which would be for a smaller scene. It's at 1 right now, and I think it might benefit from 10 or higher. What this basically does is increases the density of the atmosphere. The higher up in the atmosphere you are, the faster the light will cut off. So it makes an easy way to create a scene that maybe might not be perfect real-world scale and still get a good atmosphere that's going to reflect the scale that you'd like. So this will basically increase the haze amount, the density, the haze, the glow effect. So the more we increase this, we'll see a bigger change. And you can see a little bit of haze showing now on the right. I'm going to bring that back to 10 for now. It might need to go a little higher. The higher off the ground you are, the more that's going to increase. And the effect of the aerial perspective. Eventually to a point where the sky will be black and you'll be out of the atmosphere. So if I was to set this to, say, 100, now if we look, we're basically at the edge of the troposphere. So I'm just going to cancel that and go back to my other camera. I'm also going to go ahead and add another procedural terrain. Size that down. And we're going to move that just behind where the rocks are. And the camera's pretty low to the ground right now. I'll probably end up lifting it up in the end. And just put that other terrain just on the side here. And I'm going to add that, just the same grass variation material as before. We're going to go into a different camera, just so we can see the scene from a different view. And what I want to do is select this terrain, add an ecosystem, and we can use some of the same plants as before, the same trees. We'll use cherry trees, maple, alder. We'll also put in gnarly trees, and that should be good. I'm going to reduce the maple once again and the overall scaling. Populate it. What we can also do is I'm going to go over to the Presence tab, and we can adjust the ecosystems just as we would other materials as well with the presence, the ability to control based on altitude and slope and orientation. So if I reduce the slope range down to about 40, so it's 0 to 40 degrees, so on flatter surfaces it will populate, and we could spread that out by adjusting the fuzziness level, kind of transition it in. And I'm going to increase the density a little bit, switch it over to dynamic pop. And we'll go back to the other camera so we can see what that looks like. And then I'm going to go back to the other camera, and we can see where the current camera view is showing. And then we're going to take a look at the global ecosystem. So we can go up to the ecosystem painter, or the xStream painter if you're running through a host application. And what I want to do is add in some rocks. Just use some rough rocks. And grab from the lower part of the list to get some lower polygon objects. It looks like that one actually might be a lot higher. And it will give you an approximation of the polygon count, which is nice in the description. And so that should be good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to paint a bit of everything. And if you want to get a general idea of scale, you can keep it the single instance mode and just kind of click. Looks like those are going to be really large rocks. It looks like my scene's kind of small. So now we can see a variation. Now the overall scaling is controlled by the eco-population rules, whether or not the use population rules is checked on. So if we click edit and we go to scaling and orientation, the maximum size variation is applied regardless of whether or not that's checked. So let's go ahead and bring that down to 0.3, and the overall scaling will apply. And this is also a way to change the individual size of each object within the painter. We can also set our display quality in here, and there's an option to just access the display quality up at the top of the painter, where we can also choose to hide it from the render, but that can also be done by clicking on the icon for the ecosystem. Now if we want to use the ecosystem population rules, we can go over to presence. And if you remember, that other material went to about 40 degrees or so. So we'll restrict this one from 38 to 180. Switch to the brush mode. And now it'll only paint on the steeper surfaces. And we can increase the radius, adjust our scale a little, and then we can change the density if we want more objects to be created. And if you want to use a pressure-sensitive tablet to control or drive any of these with pressure, you can go ahead and click on these buttons on the right. We can also use this tool to change the color of instances. So if I want to take everything I've currently got and start modifying the colors, maybe make them a little darker towards the bottom, we can go to the coloring and scaling tool, so we can change the color and the scale of the instances. So I'm going to just turn on coloring and then change the color to a darker brown. And then we can adjust the influence of that and the pressure. And basically what we'll see is our instance previews start to get a little darker. So we might need to increase that coloring amount in order to get a dramatic impact. So if we also want to change their scale, maybe make them a little bit larger. And it does work with the airbrush mode, so we have to kind of leave the mouse over it for a little bit if the scale is pretty small. We can increase the scale further. And that should be good. And just be able to see those rocks kind of showing up there. We could also go back into the painter, and if I want to just paint around the rim here, and I am going to have to turn off the use population rules because this is on a flat surface. Just add an edge of rock on the side there. And maybe we'll go ahead and continue it with the top view. And if you want to leave the panel open but navigate in the scene and manipulate other things, you can turn the painting mode on and off in order to be able to select or manipulate anything. Go ahead and change the scale. And I'm just going to go back to that other ecosystem and increase the density. Just on our hill that's in the back. And I'm going to go ahead and preview the first ecosystem we created on the front here for the foreground. I'll probably make a few changes to that just in the scale, especially with the grass layer in the first layer, because there's probably way too much variance for the scale we have. So go ahead and increase that to actually 1.6 and then update the preview. And I want to add one more ecosystem to this center area. So what I'm going to do is select ecosystem, and we're going to create a grass ecosystem. Go ahead, add the patch of grass, and we'll just use the patch of grass. I'm going to go ahead and increase the density. Switch to dynamic population. Populate, we're going to take a look at how this shows up. Now, this terrain is quite large, and we're only really using a small portion of it, so there is a better way to manage the population. Now, I'll probably need to decrease the scale, but what I want to do is edit the alpha. We can do that by going into the terrain editor, and if we go to our materials, that new eco is added in there as a layer. We will go ahead and change this to grass eco, a shorter material name, and we can see that better here. So if we go up to the top of the terrain editor, we can show the entire scene. It's also going to show ecosystem instances. You can see that we really only need this first portion of grass, and all of the rest of this is showing. So I'm going to hold down Shift and double click on the area in front of the camera. And this is the area we need to keep. Now, because the alpha in this case really has to work as an inverted painting, because at the moment manipulating the alpha within the material editor is kind of a bad idea. If you export an alpha, then you can work with it, invert it, but modifying filters, you'll end up with additional layers being added, and it just doesn't work very consistently. So just kind of keeping that dot there, we can see where we need to have the ecosystem and what to avoid. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is switch to the paint material, select the grass eco. It is set to invert, which is what we need. We're going to increase the flow all the way. I'm going to make sure airbrush is off and increase our fall off quite a bit. And because our overall colors are very similar, I'm going to change the one underneath. Go ahead and copy the color and just make it lighter. We'll just make it lighter for now so that we can see the other material underneath it. Oh, go back, edit the object. So I'm just going to use this and kind of paint around this area just to get a nice defined line. And that should be good. So now we just need to fill in everything around it. Start with a small brush for the close-up area, and then we can just work our way to a really large brush and just fill in those big spots. And then we can go back and paste that color in for the lower layer so that it doesn't change the overall coloring of the material below it. So now if we take a look, I accidentally flipped the terrain, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And it looks like that removed the ecosystem, so I just need to redo the preview because of the dynamic population. Rather than actually going through each individual material, we could just render something small, just initiate the render. It'll populate, and then I can cancel it if I don't want to finish the render. And it looks like something happened to the spline and the filled ecosystem, or actually both ecosystems. So I'm going to go back and edit the object, and it looks like dynamic population, or looks like that may not be working at the moment on the splines. So if you have to switch to a static population, you can just turn off dynamic pop in order to preserve that. And that grass ecosystem needs a little adjustment. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the scale to about 0.4 or so, and increase the density. And the shaded billboards are just kind of showing up over this. It looks like their scale might still need to be brought down a little. It does look like decaying of foreign objects is also not working properly. So what I can do is go into the terrain editor, go back, copy that one color, change that to something lighter so we can see the underlayer again. And we'll just fill in the area that terrain is. And because the pixel resolution is kind of low, I'm going to go ahead and just double that resolution so we can get a finer line. And that should be alright. So that looks like it should be working out pretty well. So now we can adjust the lighting. We can go to the atmosphere editor, we can go to the sun tab, or we can manually adjust the light. I'm just going to go ahead and lift it up a bit into the sky. About 30 degrees or so. And we'll keep the azimuth where it's at the moment. I'm going to go to the sky fog and haze tab and just bump up my aerial perspective a little bit more because the scene's a lot smaller than real world scale. Actually, maybe. Let me just go bring it up to 12. Should be good. What I'm also going to do is just add a cloud layer. Go to Atmosphere, add cloud layer. And we'll use the dark cumulus. And those can be found under Clouds and Spectral 2. And the Spectral 2 clouds are better looking clouds overall. Even though the actual version is up to version 3, the technical version, the displayed volume, if we were to edit the material and look under lighting and effects for the volumetric material, we're using the lighting model version 2, as opposed to version 1, which does not include the feathers or the sharpness option, and the lighting overall with them is not quite as good. We have the shadows being cast on the scene from the clouds. We can adjust the shadow density, bring it down if we wanted, also increase ambient lighting. We can go to the light tab and then we can fine-tune the balance between sunlight and ambient. Typically when you bring it towards ambient, you'll want to have either global illumination or radiosity active as well. I'm going to go ahead and bring it to just around 60. The higher the sun is in the sky, the more you would bring it towards sunlight. The lower the sun is to the horizon, the closer it is to the horizon, then you would bring it more towards ambient. And then we can adjust, if we go to the front view, we'll see the cloud object. We could change the scale of it, move it around. It shows us our height of the object. And we go ahead and put that where we can reach it in the camera in case we want to kind of fine-tune exactly where the clouds are, because we can go ahead and just move that around to update it. And then if you want the clouds to be a little larger, we can scale them up either with the object here, or we can also manipulate this scale for the material. We can also change the height of the clouds here. And I also want to note that the height is typically about half of what is entered into this height because of the altitude variations and the other advanced controls within color density, like the cloud modulation. because the altitude variation controls all of these cloud modulations. So without any altitude variation, those other settings won't apply. The intensity is really controlled by the altitude variation.